Victorian Premier Dan Andrews there. Well, joining me now from our Parliament House studio is Victorian Liberal Senator James Paterson. James, thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
Does Dan Andrews have a point there that given that Victoria might potentially lose hundreds of millions of dollars worth of investments if this BRI deal is torn up, should the Commonwealth be stepping in with some sort of compensation?
The short answer, Jane, is no, he doesn't have a point. I mean, one very important data point here is that the state of New South Wales exports more to China than the state of Victoria does, and it's never had a Belt and Road Agreement. A Belt and Road Agreement is completely unnecessary to facilitate trade between any state and China. In fact, the best thing that facilitates trade between Australia and China is the Free Trade Agreement between Australia and China, which this federal government, brought into force in 2015. States, we do a lot to encourage trading opportunities for states. We have taken the number of our trading partners covered from 25% when we first came to government up to 70% today, and that's well on its way to 80 and 90% and beyond as we seek to secure agreements with the European Union, the United Kingdom and others. So there'll be no shortage of trading opportunities for Victorian businesses or any other business.
But is it reasonable to block an investment deal? I mean, this is less about exports, more about direct investment in the state on national security grounds if that state's potentially going to miss out on a whole lot of money.
Well, Daniel Andrews hasn't provided any evidence whatsoever to explain what additional investment will come to Victoria as a result of his Belt and Road deal. The truth is that what he has signed with the Chinese Communist Party is effectively a glorified joint press release. It's not legally binding, it imposes no obligations on either party, but it's damaging in that form because it undermines Australia's national strong position of not participating in the Belt and Road Agreement, and it stems from a place of, frankly, ignorance and lack of expertise on the part of the Victorian government when it comes to foreign affairs.
Well, Labor's Kimberley Kitching has already tweeted that she doesn't think the laws announced today go far enough because they're about government-to-government agreements rather than agreements between private companies. Should these laws actually apply to commercial deals with private companies as opposed to ones just made with foreign governments?
Well, it's good to have Senator Kitching's enthusiastic support for this. To her credit, she was one of the few Labor politicians willing to criticise Daniel Andrews and his government for entering into this arrangement. The others were mostly silent on it. But directly to her suggestion here, well, that's what the Foreign Investment Review Board is for, and this government has boosted its resources and its powers and its personnel to make sure it can carefully scrutinise all of those deals to make sure they are in our national interest, and particularly in the areas of critical infrastructure.
Well, Labor leader Anthony Albanese, in his speech a bit earlier, seemingly is moving towards supporting these laws, but he does point out that, like Kimberley Kitching has sort of mentioned, there's a big deal that has received a lot of criticism. That's the Port of Darwin lease to the Chinese group Land Bridge. Why shouldn't that be subject to these new laws?
Well, I was very critical of that decision. I've said on the public record that I think that was a mistake, and if it were put forward again today, I think there's zero chance that an arrangement like that would be approved again. I think the world has moved on a little bit since when that occurred, and the toughened scrutiny of the Foreign Investment Review Board will ensure that any future deal like that will be subject to this kind of scrutiny, and I think we'll find a very tough time.
The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, when he was asked today who these laws were targeting, he said it wasn't about China, but is it not a fact that many of the deals that will probably end up getting torpedoed if this legislation passes will be deals done with China?
Well, it applies to every foreign government. It doesn't just single out any single foreign government, and they'll be assessed rigorously on the basis of Australia's national interest. So if a deal with China or any other country threatens our national interest, it will be vetoed as it should be.
But most contentious deals, arguably to date, are those that have been struck with China, right?
Well, clearly the Victorian government's Belt and Road deal has been the most contentious. I've been calling for it to be scrapped for almost a year now.
Would you expect it to be scrapped under this legislation?
Well, it's generated enormous community concern, and in my view, for very good reason. Now, I don't know what the Foreign Minister or the Prime Minister will decide ultimately on this, but I think it's exactly deals like that that this arrangement needs to be in place for to scrutinise.
And what about the Confucius Institute? That's another arm of, I suppose, the Chinese government that has been criticised. These are institutions embedded within universities that are meant to be teaching Chinese culture, but are seen by some quarters as a sort of a soft propaganda tool. Do you think that is also a questionable deal that's been done with universities?
I was very pleased to see in the announcement today that universities are covered under this arrangement, and that any arrangements they enter into with foreign governments, the Chinese government or any other, will also be scrutinised. And you're right to say that Confucius institutes are funded directly by the Chinese government, that the agreements that universities have with a Chinese Chinese government entity, and that they are unquestionably a propaganda tool for the Chinese Communist Party abroad. So yes, they should face some very tough scrutiny under these arrangements.
And James Paterson, I want to ask you about yesterday's speech by China's #2 diplomat in Australia. It was pretty fascinating. We don't often hear from, members of the Chinese regime, but he seemed to outline a very long list of grievances Beijing has with Australia right now, and he likened it to a friction in a relationship, but ultimately said it's because of Australia, it's not because of anything Beijing has done. I wanted to get your response on what he said yesterday.
I really welcome Chinese diplomats in Australia exposing themselves to that kind of scrutiny. That's certainly not the kind of scrutiny they would face at home from their media. So I think it's a very healthy thing that he fronted up and answered questions as he did in the press club. I have to say I found some of the things he said difficult to reconcile with reality, particularly his denial about whether the virus originated in Wuhan or not, particularly his denial that the Chinese counterparts of Australian ministers have been refusing to return their phone calls. Those are pretty plain and obvious facts. And I think our relationship will be on a much healthier, stronger footing if we acknowledge those obvious facts. I think that's a good starting point.
Yeah, I mean, he seemed to acknowledge that there are irritants in the relationship, but again, saying that it's because of actions that Australia has taken, as opposed to anything that Beijing has done. So there's not a lot of sort of self-reflection or responsibility there for any actions his country's taken.
Well, I certainly don't accept his characterisation. The only thing that Australia has ever done is stand up for our national interest, our sovereignty and our values, and that hasn't impacted any of our other international relationships. In fact, they're very healthy international relationships. If it has in any way impacted our relationship with the Chinese government, well then that's a reflection on the Chinese Communist Party, not on us.
All right, James Paterson, we'll leave it there. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Jane.
Okay.